Hey everybody, do you want to extend your garden season or possibly even garden year round? Stay tuned and we'll talk about that. Hey, welcome to Country Girl with Kathy Jarvis, and today we're going to talk about greenhouses, our high tunnels, and what options they give you. It's important to understand how to use these structures properly before you make the decision to go and buy them. A greenhouse or high tunnel will help you to extend the growing season and actually help you to grow year round if you choose the right type of crops. Gardening inside the greenhouse is just basic gardening. There's a few extra things that you have to consider though. First, you have to decide what type of greenhouse you want. Do you want a freestanding one? Do you want one a lean-to against a building? Do you want a high tunnel, a do-it-yourself cattle panel fence, or a glass greenhouse, a poly greenhouse? You have to make all these decisions first. And once you decide what type you want and what type of design you want, then you have to consider location of your greenhouse. Placing the greenhouse where it can get the most sun is ideal, and usually the best place is for the long side to be facing south. However, I realize that not everybody can do this in every garden, so place it in the sunniest location that you can. And the more sunlight the plants receive, the better they're going to grow. Plus, it will help keep the greenhouse warmer in the winter. Now, I got two greenhouses that have the long side going to the south. The new greenhouse will have to have the long side going to east and west because they don't have any more space for north and south. So you have to consider what you have on your property and where you can put it. Another thing to consider is the wind direction. You want your greenhouse to be protected from the heavy wind as much as possible, so try to tuck it away where the wind won't damage it. Most of the greenhouses, if you buy a kit, and that's another thing you decide if you want to buy a kit or if you want to do it yourself, but most of the kits come with a warning on how much snow they can take, how much wind they can take, and how much ice they can take, and give you directions on how to handle the situation if it does arise. Another thing you have to watch out for is the drainage. You don't want it to be on perfectly flat ground where your water is just going to pool. You want it to have a slight grade so that the water will drain away from the greenhouse. That's another thing, thinking about water. You have to have it located in an area where you can get to the water easily, where you can get either a hose to it or you can run water to it. And the same thing with electricity if you're going to use an electric heater or if you want lights. Now, I don't have electricity in mine, any of my three, and I use solar energy and I use propane heaters when I need to. But I do not heat it year round. I only heat it when we have ice storms or snowstorms that they say the ice and snow is going to be accumulative more than what the greenhouse is rated for. Then I will turn the heaters on the night before, leave them heat up all night long and prevent, or however long the storm goes, to help prevent that from building up on the greenhouse itself. So you got to consider things like that too. Another thing that you need to consider is convenience. You want it closer to your house. You don't want to make it blocks away really, really far, especially in the winter if you're gardening year round. You don't want to run 2 blocks to get some lettuce for a salad or in the middle of winter. So it needs to be convenient to where you're at. You need to be able to make it a place that you enjoy going to and that's close by so that you will hang out there. Because if you don't get there to take care of your plants aren't going to thrive. So now you have your greenhouse. You have decided what kind of greenhouse you want. You've decided where you're going to put it. And your next thing you have to decide is what type of gardening you're going to do. Are you going to do containers? Are you going to do raised beds? Or are you going to go into the ground? Now, a lot of this will depend upon your budget. If you're just getting started and you put out a whole bunch of money for a greenhouse, you might not have the money on hand to buy raised beds or a bunch of containers. So your easiest thing to do is just to till up the ground and plant directly into the ground. That also gives you a first season of getting to know your greenhouse and deciding how you really want. Maybe you like the in-ground, once you get started. But usually what you do outside in your garden, your regular garden, usually works just as well inside. Now, I've used all three. I have containers in my garden, I have in-ground beds in my garden, and I have raised beds in my garden. And they all work fine. I prefer the raised beds for the root crops. I prefer the in-ground beds for the tomatoes and the peppers. I prefer containers for my herbs. It just kind of helps them, keeps them contained, especially the ones that like to go wild like mint. So that's the way I do it. If you want to grow year-round, you should consider growing methods that allow you to make the most out of the small space in greenhouse. And really, you should buy the biggest greenhouse that you can fit on your property and that you can afford. But it's still going to be too small. No matter how much you try, you're still going to think, we need a bigger greenhouse. So you might look into square foot gardening or vertical growing. I use both those methods in the greenhouse. Anything to get as many plants in there as I possibly can. Another thing you have to consider when you're working in a greenhouse is the temperature and humidity. The biggest difference between gardening outdoors and gardening inside a greenhouse are the temperature and the humidity. When you're planning ahead of your usual growing season, you run the risk of your plants not being warm enough. In most cases, it's important to make sure that your greenhouse is sealed up tight to keep all the other elements out that might destroy your crops. And you may have to use some coverings over the new seedlings or something to help keep them warm, especially if you don't have electricity out there and can't have heat or a heating mat for them. During the warmer seasons, then you have to open it up and allow the plants to breathe the fresh air, and you have to be able to let the pollinators come in, or you have to do it yourself. You will need to watch out for pests. They'll have a harder time finding the plants, but they will find them eventually. So you're going to have to use the same procedures that you used outside that you use inside the greenhouse to take care of the bugs and the diseases that you don't want in the greenhouse. You also still have weeds. Not as many, but you will have some. So you're going to have to keep up with the weeding. And you must provide the basic needs for your plants. You're not going to have the benefit of the rainfall. And so you're going to have to go in there and water them on a regular schedule when they need it. You're going to have to fertilize about once per month. And you're going to have to understand that you may have to do your own fertilization or pollinate. You may have to pollinate your own plants if the bugs, the bees can't get in there. So kind of look around, make sure there's bees coming in, or otherwise do it yourself. Also, you need to mulch to keep the moisture into the ground because it gets hot in there and it will evaporate quickly. And you have to remember to harvest everything. And keep, the more you harvest, the more you're going to get. And keep your plants pruned back so that airflow, when you open up the vents and the doors, that the air can flow through the plants. Just like the regular garden outside, it's important to plan what you want to plant. And there are certain plants that do really, really well in the greenhouse, and that would include ginseng, mushrooms, bamboo, all your herbs, your leafy green vegetables, microgreens, your spinach, your cucumbers, your peppers, your tomatoes, Swiss chard, lemons, oranges, grapes, strawberries, peaches, Sorrento, raspberries, chilies, okra, sweet potatoes, French beans, melons, cabbage, peas, Brussels sprouts, leeks, onions, sweet corn, broccoli, pumpkin, carrots, and then flowers. We have geraniums, impatiens, petunias, elephant ears, ferns, poinsettias, pansies, mums, and coleus, and last of all, garlic. Those are all wonderful plants to be grown inside of a greenhouse. So choosing the plant variety is important, but what's also important is when to plant the crops. To enjoy an earlier extension season, you can plant usually up to 2 months earlier than what you could outdoors. The rule of thumb is that for every layer of plastic you move one zone, like I'm in 6A, the greenhouse would be considered 7A. But still, you have to watch those nighttime temperatures and be prepared to cover them if they need to, or add heat if needed for those occasional nights when it's still, because the outside temperature is not going to be that much different at nighttime when the sun goes down. Your hardier crops, such as spinach, can be directly sown into the greenhouse, but other varieties may have to be started from seeds and transplanted in. If your greenhouse is heated, you might be able to grow year-round. But if you don't, depending upon your zone, you don't have a heated greenhouse, you may still be able to grow the hardier crops year-round. We grow lettuce and Swiss chard and turnips year-round. You can start your seeds out in the greenhouse, but you have to pay attention to the temperature, and don't start them any earlier than 8 weeks before the frost date, and make sure that by the time they're ready to go outside, the ground will be ready to accept them if you're going to transplant them outside. When planting the greenhouse, you have to ask yourself the same questions that you asked yourself when you're planting your garden. What do I want to plant? What does my family like to eat most? If your family doesn't like beets, there's no need for you to grow beets. And if you like beets and nobody else does, then you don't have to grow many of them, just enough for you. Of course, the number that you grow will depend upon your family size, your zone where you live in, and whether you know how to preserve food or whether you want to even preserve food. Because if you want to preserve food, you're going to have to grow more than what if you just want to grow enough to get by through the summer, to go out and pick and eat during the summer. You don't really have to worry about the space so much because, like I said earlier, you can do square foot gardening. You can go up high vertically. You can even put shelves and put things on shelves. There's a lot of different ways that you can maximize the space inside your greenhouse. But you need to plan the layout. Do you want to have shelves? Do you want to have raised beds permanently, or do you want to be able to move buckets around? Do you want a bench to sit on or a chair to sit on in there? These are all questions that you have to think about when you're deciding how to lay out your garden. I usually don't have my potting bench inside. My potting bench is in my garden shed, which works out fine. I just plant them there, take the plants out and put them in the greenhouse. I do have chairs, just regular comfortable little chairs, nothing fancy, just to sit down when you're tired and you just need to rest before you go home. So regardless of how you decide to lay out your greenhouse, you have to keep it neat and clean. At the end of the season, make sure you clean everything up, clean out the beds, clean up the pots, and get ready for the next bunch to go in. If you have a potting bench and potting area where you store stuff, make sure that keeps it clean too, because you don't want the bugs or the weeds to grow in there. The last thing that you should consider if you're planning to use your greenhouse for starting seeds is whether you need to heat it or not, and what source of heat you're going to use. And this will depend a lot on the type of weather you have, if you're going to garden year-round, and what you're growing. A lot of the seeds can be directly planted into the greenhouse, into the beds, as early as February and March. Your seeds can be started indoors and taken out to the greenhouse if it's too cold out there. And then you can harden them off out there and put them into the ground, which is what I do, so I don't have to heat the greenhouse. Like I said, I only heat it when we're having an ice storm or a snowstorm that requires it. So when you're deciding whether you need heat, take in consideration what you're growing. If you're growing cold weather plants, you really don't need heat usually. If you're trying to grow tomatoes in the middle of the winter, yes, you will need heat. But also consider how much heat you're going to need and the type of greenhouse you have. Because a single layer poly greenhouse is going to be a lot harder to heat than a double layer greenhouse. So take in consideration that. And if you're thinking about heating, if it's going to be electric, you got to run electric out there. If it's going to be propane, you got to have a propane tank. If you're going to use wood stove, that means getting up in the middle of the night and going out and putting more wood onto the stove. So there's a lot of different ways you can heat the greenhouse. It's just got to decide which one you prefer and whether you prefer to do it at all. So basically, those are some things to consider when thinking about a greenhouse, whether you really want one, what kind you want, and just kind of compare the outside gardening to the inside gardening. So hopefully this has helped you a little bit, and good luck on your gardening. Like I said, we're putting up another greenhouse this summer. We'll be our third one. And I love gardening inside the greenhouse. And I eventually hope to move most of my beds into the greenhouse and not have many outside, and turn the beds that are outside into either blackberries or flowers. So remember, dream big, follow that dream, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.